be named LEAD, Leadership, Excellence, Action, and Development. And so that's the different characteristics or different traits that we're looking at for all of you to help you and support you. You have a couple ways in which you'll be able to engage with us this morning. You will be able to post questions in the chat, so please feel free to use the chat. Once we have wrapped up, we'll unmute or allow you to unmute. I think right now everybody in this setting is either able to mute themselves or the host has us muted. And we are very excited to have you with us this morning. This morning we do have Kirsten Bayer, who is our online marketing coordinator for the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support. She has a master's degree in communications. She teaches communications and public speaking at Richland Community College. And I think she has a lot of great things that she's put together to assist all of us in looking at public speaking. So our session today, we can move to the next slide. Our session today is Find Your Voice, which is best practices on public speaking. And so I really think this is going to be a great session for you. So with that, I'll hand the floor over to Kirsten.
Thank you, Amy. Molly, you can go to the next slide. Like Amy said, my name is Kirsten Bayer, and I'm the online marketing coordinator for our center at ISU. Next slide, Molly. And just a little bit of background about me. Like Amy said, I teach public speaking 101. I'm an instructor at Richland Community College, and I also have 2 years of experience teaching communication as critical inquiry at Illinois State University. So I have 3 years of instruction with public speaking. And then I also have my bachelor's and master's degree from Illinois State, both in communication fields as well. So I feel like I have a good breadth and depth of knowledge to give you guys today with tips and tricks to help us better our public speaking skills. So next slide, please, Molly. Okay, so first we're going to start off with a poll just to kind of gear where you're at with public speaking. So which form or forms of communication are you most comfortable with? You can select all that apply. Are you most comfortable with electronic communication? I know that's pretty much all we're doing right now, right? Face-to-face communication. Are you comfortable with meetings and small groups, or are you comfortable with presenting yourself and that individual communication? So what are you the most comfortable with? Or you can select all of them or select a couple of them just to kind of gear your skill set. Great. So Molly has closed that poll and shared the results with us. So it looks like most of us are extremely comfortable with communicating over the telephone or, via Zoom like we're doing right now. You're comfortable with that face-to-face individual communication, whether it's one-on-one. You're comfortable with meetings and small group communication, which is great. But a lot less of us, you'll notice, about 50% less actually, is actually comfortable with individual communication and with presenting themselves. So that's what we're here to talk about today, right? Public speaking, and how we can kind of be comfortable in that uncomfortableness. So you can go ahead and close that poll, Molly, and go to the next slide for me. So our next slide is another poll. So I'm going to give you a scenario. So imagine that you were told by your supervisor you have 5 minutes to prepare for an impromptu presentation to the OET management team about a current project your supervisor assigned you only a week ago. How do you feel in this scenario? How would you feel in this scenario? And you can check all that apply. Okay, and then whenever Molly closes that poll for us and shares the results, so we can see we are across the board, right? Just completely sprinkled with all sorts of feelings and sweaty palms and increased heart rate. So many of you said you would feel anxious or some form of anxiety and you would have racing thoughts. I can't imagine a supervisor doing this. Hopefully this doesn't happen to you, but it might happen to you or it might happen in the future, right? And so those feelings of nervousness and anxiousness and feeling unprepared, and then your physical traits of that increased heart rate and the sweaty palms and your racing thoughts are all things that we call communication apprehension. And so if you want to go to the next slide, Molly. And so communication apprehension is not to be confused with a couple different terms. So the definition of communication apprehension is the level of anxiety triggered by the real or anticipated communication act as defined by McCroskey, and the fear of judgment from the audience and self-image is what fuels that anxiety. So, communication apprehension is a certain level of anxiety, but there is a difference between communication apprehension and actual communication anxiety. So, I've really come to know that difference, and it's really hard to describe, but I've come to know it very in depth when I've been instructing my students, because I've had students that they do experience those communication apprehension feelings of nervousness and anxiousness, and their palms are sweaty and their heart is racing, and maybe they get a little choked up or they stutter over their speech when I'm teaching. But um, they then I have students who um, come to me before they're about to public speak and they are sick to their stomach. Like, I've actually had a student get sick in class when we were in person before, because they were having such a deep level of communication anxiety. And so communication apprehension is not that fear that drives such a physical anxiety that you actually get sick, or it's to that level, but it's that those natural nerves, it's that natural anxiety, that natural fear that our body experiences right before we're about to public speak. And communication apprehension is actually something that we can learn management techniques and learn skills to utilize and use for our benefit. So we can actually embrace our communication apprehension and use it to our benefit when we're about to public speak. So if you want to go to the next slide, Molly. So natural nerves is very similar to communication apprehension, and it's something that we experience within our communication apprehension. And the key to finding your voice is embracing your nerves. And so we want to embrace our natural nerves, embrace our communication apprehension, and that base level communication anxiety. Not talking about that extended level anxiety, right? Some people actually do have that real anxiety, fear of public speaking, and they might need to seek medical help or something like that. But this is just talking about the natural nerves, and kind of what that poll was focused on. So, our nerves actually keep us focused and they keep us from procrastinating before we have a presentation, right? The more prepared you are, the less nervous you're going to be. And a Harvard Business School professor, Allison Wood Brooks, stated this quote, that the argument is that anxiety and excitement, and I would even add natural nerves, are actually very close together, but that anxiety and calmness are too far apart. And so she goes on to say in the next slide, Molly, um, that focusing on that excitement and focusing on those nerves as a positive thought, rather than a negative thought, actually increases our performance. And telling people, like, if you're ever about to give a speech or give a presentation and you're nervous, and you tell your coworker in the cubicle next to you, like, oh my gosh, I'm so nervous to give this speech. I really hope, so and so likes it, blah, blah, blah. And they tell you, oh, just calm down, just relax, it'll be fine. That's actually counterproductive to your mental state for them to tell you that. And that's due to the fact that they're basically telling you in your mental state that the feelings of nervousness that you're feeling are negative, or they should be associated with negative, and you should try to calm them down or relax them. But that's actually counterproductive, right? Because we want to hone in on those nerves. We want to rewire our brain to think of them as positive feelings. I know when your palms are sweaty, it doesn't necessarily feel real good. So it's kind of hard to rewire your brain to think positively about that. But it's it's that adrenaline rush, right? And so there's times in your life where you have that adrenaline rush where afterwards you're like, oh my gosh, that was such a thrill, like what an adrenaline rush. And then you have times in your life where like, oh my gosh, that I don't ever want to experience that adrenaline rush again, right? It was so scary. And so I think society has taught us and engraved in us that public speaking is that adrenaline rush that is that we should associate with negatively and we should not want to feel again. But we need to rewire our brain to actually associate that adrenaline rush before, and those nerves and that communication apprehension that we get before public speaking, to actually be positive. And that was such a thrill, and we want to do that again. We want to get better at it. So that's kind of why we're here today. So if you could go to the next slide, Molly. Oh, you're already there. Oops. Oh, no, you're not. You're good. You're good. Pre-performance rituals. There we go. Okay, so there's some tips and tricks that I'm going to provide you with, as well as some management strategies as well. So today, or on this slide, I want to talk about pre-performance rituals. So if you've ever had, we all have our routine throughout the day, right? And it's kind of like developing a routine before you're about to public speak. So maybe before you're about to public speak, you take a pause and you take a deep breath and you remind yourself why you care. Why is this presentation important? Visualize your entire presentation. Visualize it going well. And maybe even listen to a song or do something physical that gives you that jolt of positive energy. And some other things that I wanted to know is that it's always good to have something in your hands. I don't know about you, but myself as a public speaker, if you could see me right now, I'm actually moving my hands a lot. And maybe you have a pen in your hands or notes, or back when we were in person and we had clickers for our slides, or if you have a microphone, etc. So that way you're not so distracting to the audience. So maybe that pre-performance ritual is to get whatever that physical thing is in your hands. And I think to go along with reminding ourselves why we care and to visualize our entire presentation, I think it's normal. We need to embrace that it's normal to have that stage fright. It's normal to have that communication apprehension. You are not alone. There's nothing wrong with you. Everyone has it. I mean, you saw the poll, 88% of us were experiencing those feelings, right? So it's normal to have that so-called stage fright, but to remind ourselves why we care, remind ourselves why we're there, whether it's just a presentation that maybe you're pitching a new idea to your boss and you're really passionate about it. That's why you care. And to remind yourself that people chose to be there and people want you to do a good job. Your coworkers want you to succeed. Your boss wants you to succeed. They want you to do a good job. And I think reminding ourselves of that like helps us rewire our brain, right? And think those positive thoughts and rewire that adrenaline to a more positive note. Next slide, please, Molly. So next I'm going to talk about management strategies. And these are strategies that I think sometimes before we're about to public speak or do something that scares us in life, we actually do without really realizing it. And it goes into us building our pre-performance ritual, right? So the management strategies that I'm going to discuss today are reality testing, which is also known as cognitive restructuring. I'm also going to discuss selective relaxation, which is also known as systematic desensitization, and then visualization, and then skills training as well. So go to the next slide, please, Molly. So reality testing or cognitive restructuring is the notion of brainstorming the worst scenarios that could possibly happen and restructuring your thinking. So if you have a big presentation, the next day, have you ever experienced being able to not sleep? You're restless, your nerves kind of kick in way before you're about to walk into the meeting room, right? Or way before you're about to get on the Zoom call. You're restless, you can't sleep, you're tossing and turning because your mind is just going through all the worst scenarios that could possibly happen. And cognitive restructuring and reality testing is testing those realities that your brain is, concocting up in your head and restructuring that thinking. So taking those negative things and restructuring them to a positive scenario. So some of the most common ones I get is, what if my PowerPoint fails? What if my visual aid fails? It doesn't work. It won't load. It didn't save. It won't open. It's locked, whatever. And what if I forget my outline? What if I forget my notes for my presentation? What if my notes get deleted? If they're on a computer, a lot of people have that anxiety of, what if I actually do have a real panic attack while I'm presenting? What if I can't connect to my online file storage? Feel free to put in the chat, what are some of the thoughts that you guys experience when you're about to public speak, that you are afraid that's going to go wrong? I know, like, with my director, Amy, she's always the most afraid that her computer is going to BitLock her out, because it's happened to her so many times. And I have a lot of students that I teach that are nervous about silly things. What if I get sick? What if I have pit stains? That's embarrassing and no one wants that. What if your internet fails? I think that's a huge fear nowadays. And we joke around our office that the internet and Wi-Fi issues are the new traffic, right, to showing up to things. What if a family member walks in? That's happened to me before. Our office is working from home. We've been working from home since March. We've only been into the office a handful of times for this or that, or to get something. And we actually, Molly Cook, my colleague who's on this with us today, she is brand new and she was just hired recently. And when we were interviewing her, I was on the interview committee, and my husband actually walked in the middle of her interview. And I was like, oh my gosh, get out, what are you doing? So I think that's a huge fear in today's world, right? And then what if you panic right before you have to speak? I see in the chat that someone said you have a fear of forgetting what to say, or your technology problems are always the first concern. Personally, losing track of thought and getting off into a different path and rambling on. I think we're all guilty of that, right? We like to ad lib a little bit. So how can we restructure those fears? So let's do that together. So how would you restructure your fear of forgetting what to say and post, I apologize. Amy wants to chime in here. So I'll let her chime in whenever she can, but how can we restructure those fears? Amy, did you want to chime in?
No, I just wanted to let you know that there were things in the chat, and that, again, I encourage everyone to post those things, your comments in the chat, because we can see those. And yes, right now I think technology is not only the new traffic, but also the big stressor for us, because we're all working from home and there's a lot of variables. So you've covered it all. Just keep on going.
Okay. So how can we restructure those thoughts together? So how can you take that negative thought, Chelsea, of forgetting what to say, and restructure that? So you have this negative thought, I'm going to forget what to say. What do I do if I forget what to say? Okay, well, let's stop. Let's restructure that. Let's make sure we're prepared. Get up out of bed when you're feeling restless and having these thoughts the night before, and make sure you have your notes ready to go. Make sure you have double copies of your notes. Maybe you have a paper copy and a virtual copy, right? Make sure you've practiced, done that skills training that we're going to talk about in a second. So that's how you can make yourself feel more prepared and restructure that thought, by knowing that it's so unlikely that you're going to forget what to say, right? You've prepared for this speech, you have your notes, you've been practicing, you've been working on this project for X amount of time. It's so unlikely that you're going to forget what to say. And that's such an irrational thought. So you're going to cognitively restructure that and think more positively about it. You're prepared, right? Technology problems, that's a huge one. So how can we restructure that? Things that I always tell my students is have a backup. Have a backup place that you can go to. We're in a pandemic, right? We're all stuck at home. So where's your backup internet? I know Amy, she lives out in the country and she's constantly having internet issues. She always like jokes, but I think is actually really serious that her Wi-Fi is bouncing off of a grain bin. Um, and so when she has connection issues, she has a hotspot on her phone that she uses. We all have those probably right nowadays. Do you know how to use that hotspot? Do you know how to set that up? So making sure you do so that you're prepared. If something does go wrong, you can log back on. Um, Even being transparent about technology issues nowadays, I feel like people understand, right? People understand when something goes wrong with technology. It's just one of those things, right? And I think people lead with empathy. And so if you recognize that as the public speaker, then it calms you down a little bit and helps your thoughts not be so negative. And as far as personally losing track of thoughts and getting off into a different path, rambling on, those all have to do with being prepared, right? Having our notes, making sure we practice, making sure we have exactly what we want on the slide to get our point across. um, Not having the slide filled with a bunch of ad lib and a bunch of stuff to where we would just continue reading and completely ramble off, right?
Yeah,
um,
Kirsten, this is Mark.
Go ahead, Mark.
I don't know if this is something that'll come up later, but the planning was certainly what I was expecting to hear, about the forgetting what to say or rambling on. And just a quick minute of my history of presenting and speaking publicly. And Amy knows me. I'm never a loss for words if I get going on something. But you reminded me of my history in the sense I took speech class at community college when I first left high school, dropped out of it because I was so unprepared, didn't know how to go about it. And I'd get in class and I just would freeze up and I finally just dropped out. Went to ISU, which connects back to all of you presenting today. Joined the speech class, still very uncomfortable, dropped out a second time. Just couldn't get myself to do it. And finally, the third time around, I did it because I had gone into one of my major classes and basically I wasn't going to pass a major class without doing a presentation of 25 minutes long, 25 or 30, something like that. So it forced me to do the planning to say, I've got to figure out how to get through this. And then I went ahead and went back and took the speech class, but it was hard for me. And most people would never know that today. And I know I've got a lot of work to do to continue to get better at public speaking and presentations and that, and could plan and prepare a little bit better probably. But it's certainly, to me, the key thing is to know what you're speaking about, make sure you understand it. And back then I would almost write my whole presentation out to make sure I covered everything and read it over and over again, just to make sure I, again, knew what I wanted to present. And then built the presentation, from there, as far as the slides and things of that nature.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. Thank you for your input. I think a lot of students struggle with that. I see that a lot in my classes, and that's hard as an instructor because I want them to succeed, right? But I think it's a common fear. Society has engraved in us to be afraid of public speaking and to have that natural communication apprehension and to associate that with negativity. And we just want to give up. We don't want to try to overcome it. We don't want to try to manage it, right? And so that's why we're talking about these strategies and we're talking about that pre-performance ritual, because when you put those things in place and you're aware that you can do those, when you're aware that you can reality test and cognitively restructure your thoughts, if you're aware you can do that, you are more likely to do it, right? And then you're more likely to minimize that apprehension and minimize that fear and succeed in your public speaking class or succeed at your presentation or whatever it is that you're public speaking at. So thank you.
Well, I think, sorry, I want to just chime in here. I think a really good point is that looking at making sure whatever your pre-presenting strategy is works for you. What works for me might not work for Mark. What works for Kirsten might not work for me. But whatever it is, make sure that it works for you and make sure that it makes you feel calm. also, again, Kirsten and I are both hand talkers. So though you can't see me, my hands are going. And when I speak in person, I make sure that I have something in my hands, because that kind of calms me and centers me and makes sure that I know what my next thing is. Um, some people will write, and Kirsten will get into this. Some people will write notes or cliff notes. Other people will, just write 4 words on a sheet of paper and be able to speak from that for about 30 minutes. Everyone is different, but I think really what we're encouraging you to do is kind of learn your strengths and weaknesses and learn what works for you. Maybe it's that deep cleansing breath. Maybe it's something else, because with work, the catch is you can't walk out or drop out or get an F on that assignment, because at work, it's really important that you perform and get through those things. So practice, practice, practice. And I know she's going to talk about that in a little bit, but it's just really important to find those things that help you, because what helps you is really going to help you as you go into public speaking. Go ahead, Kirsten.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think a whole new ball game when we're public speaking and presenting online, right? And we'll talk about that in a second. So if you want to go to the next slide, Molly. So the next management technique that I want to talk about. So like Amy said, maybe cognitively restructuring your thoughts is not your thing. Like when those thoughts creep into your brain, you just cannot get rid of them. I think I'm guilty of that. I tend to be more of a negative person, which is kind of hard to admit about myself, but I just tend to have negative thoughts, especially when it's about something I'm going to do or when I'm self-reflecting, right? We tend to be really hard on ourselves. And so something that I utilize for my personal management technique, and I think a lot of people like to do this, is the selective relaxation or systematic desensitization management technique. And so both of those words are synonymous. It's just called one or two different things. So if you ever look any of these up, it might be labeled one of these two different terms. That's why I put both in my presentation. But basically, this is just doing something physical to calm you down, whatever that is. Listening to music, taking those deep breaths. I know for me, when I was in college, I had the worst test anxiety. So, not public speaking, but I had the worst test anxiety. And I would use this management technique to actually calm my anxiety about taking a test. And I think this is relative to public speaking and that communication apprehension as well. And I would actually watch an episode of my favorite Netflix show just to get my mind off of it, right? Just to not think about it too much. If you're prepared and you've practiced and you've done that preparation, I think we can get in our own heads too much, right? And so maybe you work out every morning. You work out right before your presentation, early in the morning, just to kind of clear your brain, like reset and rewire. So what is something, put in the chat, what is something you found to be effective? What is something you do? It's so important to be taking care of ourselves, and this filters into that. Selective relaxation is actually selecting to do something physical to relax yourself, right? So we are so go, 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 even in this pandemic. Everyone from our center is constantly on meetings all day, and we just feel so spent. And whether we're in person when this pandemic is over or now virtually, whatever that looks like for you, it's so important to take care of yourselves and do things that you would do in the office. Compartmentalize, take a walk. If you were in the office, you would get up and go talk to a coworker, right? I think when we're on our meetings, sometimes Amy will schedule a meeting with some of us and it'll be for an hour and we'll talk about what we need to talk about and we're done in 30 minutes. And it's kind of like, do we keep talking? Do we get off? And we need to take that time to keep talking. We've scheduled that time out. Let's take that time. Let's check in with each other, and have those conversations that we would have in our normal workday. And that's part of that self-care, guys. It's part of connecting. And that can help us with our public speaking too. Maybe your selective relaxation is actually being vulnerable and communicating to your coworkers or to your boss that's doing something physical, right? Communicating that you are experiencing that communication apprehension. And maybe it is listening to music, maybe it's something physical. I know I wake up and I ride my bike, my kind of faux Peloton bike that I've made every single morning. And that helps me just kind of reset for my day and whatever I have. So Even I was a little nervous to present to all of you today. It's normal, right? But I had that selective relaxation of exercising this morning that kind of calmed my nerves a little bit. Carmela, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that wrong. I'm sorry. She said, I'm so nervous and afraid at interviews. My mind blacks out, no matter how well I've prepared. And Mark said he's the opposite. He loves interviews and thinks he does well, but he tries to keep them more as casual conversations than structured critical interactions. And that's great, Mark. I think we can implement that into our public speaking too, right? So viewing that as, I think that goes into us restructuring our thoughts of knowing that everyone wants us to succeed. Everyone wants us to do good, right? We don't go into a casual conversation thinking that the other person's waiting for us to mess up, right? And so going into your public speaking scenario, whatever that looks like for you, with that mindset too. I think that's great. Thank you for participating, everyone. And so the next management technique, Molly, if you want to go to the next slide, is just a visualization. So visualize yourself. Put your thoughts and words and your actions into the world. Manifestation. I don't know if you are into that, but I am into that. Me and my husband and my family, we always say, speak about what you bring about, speak positive things into the world. Visualize and speak about you doing great on your presentation. You give it with confidence and authenticity, and you get a big pat on the back from your boss, and you kind of visualize that happening. And I truly believe it's manifestation. It's more apt to happen. And I think visualizing yourself doing a good job and having that confidence in yourself can be a management technique within itself. And so this one's kind of an easy one, but I think it's effective if you put it into practice, right? And then go to the next slide, please, Molly. And our last management technique is skills training. And that's what we're doing today, right? We're skills training. We're attending professional development. Maybe you're going to do an audience analysis, which we'll talk about that in a second. Practice your presentation. I was up until 1 a.m. last night practicing my presentation for this session this morning. Don't do that. That's bad. I'm guilty of that. Amy knows, but prepare for your virtual presentations too, right? I might not be able to see you guys, but you can still hear me, and I still need to be prepared. I still need to have my notes. I still need to have practiced. I still did an audience analysis on what the needs of OET was, right? That's why we're talking about public speaking today. So skills train, whether that's reading articles, or I have some great resources for you guys at the end of this presentation that you can do professional development on your own time or by yourself during your workday. Next slide, please, Molly. So this is our last poll. Have you ever, Molly's going to put it up for us, but have you ever presented during a meeting, especially now, especially virtually? I feel like this is so prevalent, and felt like no one is paying attention. No one is listening to you. It's so hard when we're not face to face, right? So give everyone a second to answer that poll.
Yeah, and Kirsten, this is Mark again. This one I was waiting to see if this came up, because to an earlier question, I was going to type this in, but I didn't. But I always, especially in person, when you can see people, and there's not much noise, people aren't, you don't necessarily want people talking to each other, but sometimes when you see people in the audience talking, it means they're conversing about what they're hearing. So that's at least encouraging that they're listening. But online, it's hard to see that. But when you don't see questions coming in and you don't see anything in a chat, I always wonder, am I doing too good a job in giving them everything they need, or am I doing such a poor job they're lost and have no clue what they want to ask or respond with? So that's always one of my concerns, as far as audience. I don't know if participation's the right way, but reaction to what's being presented.
Yeah.
Well, and Mark, I think that's one of the things I know with OET. Julio has made a point to say, you all need your cameras on. And so we need to see your faces, especially when you're in a meeting. And that does lend itself to the ability to kind of gauge your audience. I had a great conversation with Jody Sue Kelly. And if you all did not hear her webinars that she did on virtual case management, you should check those out. She does a fantastic job of presenting. But she brought up the point, and Mark, this kind of couples with your point, the idea that it's actually harder to prepare in the virtual realm than it was in person. In person, you could look around the room, you could see the nods, you could see people agreeing or disagreeing. And in the virtual realm, we really can't. So one of the ways that, and Kirsten, I apologize, I can't remember if you're going to cover this, but one of the ways you can encourage people to do that is like ask those questions. As we're going through the day, we're asking polling questions. Be sure, like, you have all those fun little hands clapping, thumbs up, heart, laughing face, things like that. Ask for their expressions. Cue your audience to use the tools that make online learning or online engagement more engaging, and that will kind of help you understand if you're in the right spot. But to that point, and I know Kirsten is talking about this, how much preparation is coming for online presentation is so much more, in my opinion. And I know Jody Sue Kelly and Kirsten and I have all talked about this. It's a lot more when it's online because you don't know all the questions you're going to have. And when you're in the room, if somebody asks a question, you can address that question. But a lot of times they don't ask that question. So you almost have to prepare for the questions that you assume they're going to ask. So it does make it more challenging. Go
Yes,
ahead, Kirsten. Sorry.
no, you're fine. Absolutely, Amy. So the Molly shared the poll results, and so most of you said sometimes it kind of depends on your audience. And we had a few say yes all the time and no never. So kind of across the board. Go ahead and close that, Molly, and then go to the next slide, please. So it's important. This is kind of gearing us into realizing that it's important to not only present, not only public speak, whatever that information is that you're diverging, but also to listen. A lot of people forget that a presentation is a two-way street. It's not a conversation, but it is a two-way street. People are going to ask questions. You want people to engage. You want people to react to the information that you're giving them. And so, like Amy alluded to, it's so much harder to do that in a virtual realm. But there's still ways that you can do that. And so actually forcing yourself, this is so hard virtually, forcing yourself to listen, me prompting you with those questions, like put in the chat, what are your systematic desensitization techniques that you use? And then me actually allowing you the time to put that in the chat, counting to 7 in your head virtually as the presenter. I think the rule of thumb is to like count to 10 or something like that if you're in person, to allow people to think. Give them that time to think, right? And that's really, really hard to do virtually because we are in this realm and this society of instant gratification. And so we want that feedback right away, especially virtually, because we can't see you talking to your neighbor. We can't see you pondering that thought with your nonverbals, right? But you have to force yourself to do that, public speaking. Mark, do you want to say something?
I was just going to say, what you've done already just in this first half of this presentation of using polls and encouraging use of chat. I think we, overall could do a better job of that when we do our webinars and things of that nature to get and encourage input and response from the audience. I think typically our webinars have opening and closing polls, but not too many of those in the middle of a presentation. So we can maybe do some of those, structured questions in that sense, but also the encouragement of using chat throughout. You've done a great job. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Mark. But yeah, so I think that kind of made me just think of, Mark, actually what you said is that we are not just presenters anymore. We are not just public speaking anymore because we are virtual. We almost have to turn into instructors. We have to be a teacher to our audience. We have to prompt with questions to prompt that discussion. I do that with my students all the time. My students don't want to talk to me. They don't want to talk to me. I don't even know if they're listening when I'm in person with them, but I prompt them with questions to prompt that thinking and prompt that discussion. And that's how we get that engagement with public speaking too. And that all has to deal with being prepared and thinking ahead of time. How are you going to prompt that engagement? How are you going to ask those questions to get them to really think about the content that you're presenting? And it's important to stop and listen to your audience, letting Mark interject, letting Amy interject in my presentation, and letting that not throw me off from the content that I'm presenting to you guys, stopping and listening to their feedback, because it is a two-way street. It is a two-way street. And people on the call, remembering that they are real people. I think we know that, but just remembering that people on the call are real people. They're not just logging on, listening and not really, or they're hearing and not really listening. People are really listening to you. I hope you guys are listening to me today and taking this information. So remembering that people on the call are real people. And collectively digesting that information that they give you. So, when Mark's been, I mean, this has been great. Thank you so much for interacting with me. So Mark and Amy have been interacting with me. I've digested that information and kind of reiterated it back to my content, right? So being able to do that all has to do with being really prepared and really comfortable with the content that you're presenting. Another thing that I wanted to reiterate is that I've said this a lot, but presentation is a two-way street. You are there to listen, you are there to engage and interact just as much as you are there to present, right? Okay, let's go to the next slide, please, Molly. So this is a really great quote, and I think Amy gave me this one. But as far as listening, when it comes to presentations, I think people don't realize how important it is because it's a presentation, right? It's not a conversation, but we need to view it as more of a conversation, and as more of a two-way street. And so you can give the best information in the world. I can give the best message to you guys today, but the person on the receiving end, you, my audience, will always understand it through the prism of his or her own emotions, preconceptions, prejudices, and pre-existing beliefs. And I don't know what those are. So I can have the best content in the world, but you're going to understand it through your own emotions, through your own preconceptions. And so, me trying to understand those things is me engaging with you, me prompting the chat, me asking you to be a little vulnerable today with what do you struggle with in terms of public speaking. And that's how we can kind of bridge that gap, especially virtually as well. Go ahead to the next slide, Molly. And then another great quote from Frank Luntz is that it's not enough to be correct or reasonable or even brilliant. It's not enough. It's not enough anymore. The key to successful communication is to take the imaginative leap of stuffing yourself into your listener's shoes to know what they are thinking and feeling in the deepest recesses of their mind and heart, and how that person perceives what you say is even more real, at least in a practical sense, than how you perceive yourself. So that's why listening is so important. That's why engaging is so important. Um, it's what makes a presentation, everyone. It's what makes your public speaking valuable. It's what makes the work that you're doing valuable. And we all want that, right? Go ahead to the next slide, Molly. Okay, so moving on. Let's talk about adapting to our audience. So we talked about listening, we talked about engagement, we've talked about communication apprehension and management techniques, but let's talk about adapting to our audience. So how can we make our audience want to listen to us as we're public speaking? This all has to do with being prepared, which will in return reiterate and relax us and desensitize us to our communication apprehension. It's a domino effect. So making your presentation relevant, that's the first thing. This is a kind of a checklist for you guys. How can people relate to the topic that you're speaking about? So how can you relate? How can your coworkers relate to you on a professional level? That's the first step, right? But also, how can they relate to you on a personal level or a social level? Being vulnerable, being transparent as a public speaker can only help you. And using that up to your comfortability level, maybe your version of relevancy and being vulnerable to your audience is just telling them a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background. Something that I always do, and I'm sure you've noticed this, is using examples from my real life, from my real work experience, using examples from Amy's life and Molly's life. Hopefully they don't mind. I know they don't, but providing that relevancy. And then intensity, making sure you are prepared and you think about and you practice your inflection in your voice, your rate, your alliteration. I really tried to emphasize those words, and that is me using inflection in my voice, right? It's so not what we want to do when we're preparing for a speech. We don't really think about practicing our rate or practicing our inflection in our voice, but it can be a game changer to our audience who's listening to us, right? We want to speak with conviction and power. And I'll talk about that in a second, but we want to speak with those things and be convincing and have that power behind us as a public speaker. I think when we're thinking about public speaking, everyone wants to be that TED Talk speaker, right? If you've ever listened to a TED Talk, everyone's like so amazing at public speaking. And that should be our goal. And they use intensity, they use that inflection in their voice, their rate, and their alliteration to help emphasize those points. And then contrast, comparing and contrasting concepts about your presentation to give an all-encompassing picture. So, I've said it's a domino effect. I've tried to reiterate how all of these things fall together to make you a great public speaker, or at least a better public speaker, right? And so giving that all-encompassing picture of what the goal is. And then repetition, repeating your words, repeating your intensity words, repeating those concepts and facts to drive those points home. And then also ending and beginning with the same things and bringing your speech full circle. This leads me into talking about the primacy recency effect, which is actually a cognitive study that's been done. And it's known statistically that people who are listening to anything you're saying, it could be a conversation with a friend, are more likely to remember the things that you've said at the beginning and the end of your conversation, or at the beginning and the end of your presentation. And that's called the primacy recency effect. And it's literally just the notion that cognitively our minds typically remember things at the beginning and at the end. And sometimes we remember things in the middle, details in the middle, but sometimes we kind of zone out, right? So whatever it is, whatever your goal is of the presentation, making sure you repeat that at the beginning multiple times and you repeat that at the end multiple times to drive that primacy recency effect home. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Molly, please. We're running out of time a little bit here, so I'll kind of speed through these and we can get some questions in. So we also want to analyze our audience. So consider the knowledge level of your audience and maybe complete an audience analysis if you're able to. And this can be something as simple as you knowing who's going to be in the meeting, right? Who's going to be in the meeting? Do you know those people? What are their titles? What are their backgrounds? Where do they rank on the totem pole of your organization? That can help you with analyzing your audience. Consider the time of day. Are you presenting at 9 a.m. on a Friday? Are you presenting at 4 o'clock on a Friday? That can be something you might want to take into account when you're preparing your engagement and all that. Consider closing remarks. So that primacy recency effect again, driving that home. Consider your audience's makeup and perspective. This can be things that we don't necessarily always want to think about, but I think they're important. So even if you're presenting something professionally, it's still relevant for you to think about your audience's diversity, their position level, their gender, their affiliations, their values, their beliefs, their attitudes. If you know your audience on a professional / personal level, that's always easier to do when you're doing an audience analysis. And if you adapt your speech to reflect areas of common concern with your audience's likelihood that they will give you a fair hearing and a fair listening will heighten. If you adapt your speech to reflect those areas of common concern because you've done your audience analysis, your audience will be more likely to be receptive towards that. And then be audience-centered and use empathy. Lead with empathy. When your words resonate, your audience will become more engaged. It's so important, I think, as a presenter to allow yourself to be vulnerable. If you want your audience to buy into what you're doing and to buy into the work you're doing, empathy and sharing what you do for the field and how their role in the field will impact you and impact them and impact the world and impact the work that you're doing. Basically, what I'm trying to drive home is that you're not the hero, your audience is the hero in the story and in that context. And if you have that mindset and build that into your presentation, your audience is going to be a lot more engaged and it's going to resonate with them. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please, Molly. So this is kind of a checklist. Oops, back one. Yeah, there we go. So we have Chelsea says in the chat that joining a Toastmasters club is also a great way to practice and feel comfortable public speaking and becoming a better communicator. I've never heard of a Toastmasters club. So you'll have to tell us a little bit more about that, Chelsea, in a second. And then Brian says these concepts are really important when presenting information to dislocated workers during rapid response outreach meetings. Absolutely, Brian. Hopefully you can take some of this content with you and diverge that to them. Okay, so this is kind of just a checklist for you to analyze your audience. So have you considered the demographic factors of your audience and strategize the best approach for your speech? Do you have a good understanding of your audience's values, beliefs, attitudes toward your topic, and your audience's perception as a speaker? And do you understand the purpose of your presentation and know what your audience expects of you? And those are kind of just things you can check off as you do them. Next slide, please, Molly. Then we're gonna talk about how your audience perceives you. So what is your credibility level? What is your ethos level? You have initial credibility, derived credibility, and terminal credibility. So initial credibility is maybe you established that way back when you got hired, right? In your interview. And that derived credibility is how do your coworkers and your higher ups view you now as you're working? Or how do they view you during the presentation? So maybe your initial credibility is you set that up right at the beginning of the presentation, right? I introduced myself. I said, what my background is, what makes me credible to speak about this topic. That's your initial credibility. The derived credibility is going on right now. How credible do you guys feel like I am really discussing this and trying to give you professional development on public speaking? And then your terminal credibility is, what did you think after the presentation? And so how does your audience perceive you? It's important to think about those things so you can make sure you're touching on that initial credibility at the end, and then touching on it again at the beginning, and then touching on it again at the end, excuse me. And then if you believe the audience doesn't acknowledge your authority to speak on a topic, maybe you implement your work experiences into your presentation that qualify you to speak on the topic, and then relate your own experiences too to drive that home. When you're thinking about what your audience thinks of you could change the way that they respond to the message. And so your credentials and your reputation accompany you to the podium. My colleague, Jennifer Phillips, says it's called the Tygra Banks method. You need to own your runway. And when you are the state expert, right? You guys are the state experts. You need to own your runway. And what if a lot of people ask me, a lot of other colleagues or students ask me, what if the audience members don't look favorably upon you? Maybe ask yourself, do they lack information about you that you can fill in your presentation? Have they received misinformation about you, or do they have a legitimate reason for holding that judgment? And you can mitigate that and implement that into your presentation as you're building it. Other important things that I wanted to reiterate is using inclusive language, talking about we instead of you or I, using that inclusive diversity. And sometimes the message that we have, the audience doesn't want to receive it. And so it's important to keep that in mind as a presenter. Sometimes you have to tell your audience something that they don't want to receive. It's like, say an authority figure says that you're downsizing. And it's important to remember that as a presenter, sometimes it's not you, it's just the message. And you just kind of have to take that with a grain of salt. It doesn't really matter who you are sometimes, but it just matters what you're saying. And those are things that are kind of out of our control, right, as presenters. But we can try to be prepared and establish that credibility, that ethos level as best as we can to avoid those situations. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Molly. Really quickly, I'm going to breeze through these so we can get to some questions. But adjust to your speaking situation. When you deliver a presentation in person, don't you go get the room ready? Don't you go set up your slides? Make sure that each attendee in the board meeting room has any handouts they need or has a pen or whatever. you go do that, right? So don't forget to spruce up your Zoom room. Check your lighting, check your camera placement if you have your camera on. Check the background, do a virtual background. Those are really in right now, super cool. Test your audio, test your media. We do, on each one of our webinars, we always do a tech test. It's 15 minutes with any of our presenters just to make sure that everything that we need to work works, right? And then we also get on 15 minutes before any webinar just to check in, again, make sure anything works. Check our polls, make sure our polls work, make sure any breakout rooms work, things like that. Allow that interaction. So we've been allowing that today with chat and polls. You can also utilize breakout rooms. Those are great. Don't be ashamed to use notes. Even if your camera's on, don't be ashamed to use notes. I think that shows you're more prepared, right? And then show your camera if you can, if you're willing, and dress for success too, right? Even though we're go to the next slide, please, Molly. Okay, we're running out of time, but oops, you're one ahead of me. So time management for speakers, if you've ever heard of the data dumper, you don't want to be one of those, or the every minute accounted for, you don't want to be one of those. So the data dumper is a presenter who talks about every single minuscule part of the topic, and they have 100 PowerPoint slide with so much information, right? And they have charts and graphs and things that just really don't make sense, and they don't really elaborate on them. If you've ever heard one of those, try to avoid that. We want to use simplicity. We want to make it easily digestible for our audience. And then you also don't want to be an every minute accounted for presenter. So if you ever heard of death by PowerPoint, if your message isn't clear and you have, a 200 slide PowerPoint for 20 minutes, and you're just going on and on and on, and there's really no engagement. I hope you've noticed that I've tried to put not too much on these slides, so that way you can actually listen to me and you're not just like reading the slides. It's important to hone in on your message and have that bird's eye view. Have that brevity. If you have an hour speech planned for 40 minutes, clearly I didn't do too well with that. I'm kind of going over a little bit. Keep it simple with that simplicity, and then practice your timing. You can actually practice your timing on PowerPoint now, which is really cool. So make sure you look into that if you can. Next slide, please, Molly. We're almost done here. Really quickly, expressing your ideas with power and conviction. Know your audience, fellow peers, other professional groups, students, clients, or consumers. Know your audience. Keep it simple, right? Your goal should be for the audience to feel smart. I'm going to reiterate that. Your goal should be for the audience to feel smart. The curse of knowledge is that once you know something, you forget what it was like to not know it. And I'm really guilty of that with my students and with other people too. The curse of knowledge is that once you know something, you forget what it was like when you didn't know it. And so we kind of do have to be teachers when we're public speaking, right? Emphasize connection over content. That has to do with being vulnerable, and we've talked about that a little bit. Be authentic, be yourself. Who is better to speak with power and conviction than you? Be yourself. And diversify your delivery. So implement those polls, implement your visuals, engagement, and listening. And then also be prepared. So avoid reading off your PowerPoint slides. I know we're all guilty of that. Be prepared to deliver the information in a professional manner. Utilize your notes. And then you can go to the next slide. These are just some great quotes that I wanted to include. Some of them are Amy's favorites. Some of them are my favorites. Some of them are Jennifer Phillips' favorites. If you're familiar with her, she's on our team. Just a couple of them. Tell me and I forget, teach me and I may remember, involve me and I learn. So engagement is learning, right? And success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. And we have about 1 minute left, so you can go to the next slide. I have some resources for books and articles and podcasts. So you can just breeze through those, and you guys can download these slides on our website. And those are all linked for you. And then any questions really quickly? I know we only have 1 minute. Oh, I'm too young to know Toastmasters. Amy will have to tell me what it is.
Well, Toastmasters is still used. And I know because it's not his business. He works for an international IT consulting company. They put their recruiters through it. So it does cost. So I'm not going to encourage that. That's a free option, but there are some great resources out there.
Mark, I love that you dressed in a suit right after COVID.
Yeah, just the way I felt comfortable that day. I was
Yeah.
gonna say about the presentation. I find it's very difficult. I wish I could learn how to. I don't want to say that I'm monotone necessarily when I present, but I don't think I do a good job of changing it up a little, and certainly would like to add some. I don't know what, humor, I guess, and some of our topics are very difficult to do that, but you see a lot of Kelly. Jody Sue Kelly does a very good job of it, getting some humor into her presentation, even though it's pretty dry subjects that we deal with. I just wish there was a way to learn how to do that better. I see that all the time. Amy, you and I saw the gentleman, and I'm not going to remember his name, when we were in Michigan a couple of years ago, and how well he did with it and tied it still to the topic that we were there for, but he added humor to it. I just wish I could figure out how to do that better.
Something that I do, Mark, is I actually record myself presenting this whole presentation, and then I listen back to it, which can be really uncomfortable to listen to yourself talking, right? But that kind of helps me just listen to myself talk and think, oh, I could add that in there, add that in here, whether it's humor, or whether it's inflection in my voice, or pausing for emphasis, or just even a different idea that I think of that I want to touch on, and then I can make a note of that. So that might be something you might try. Robin said, on virtual work days, I'm dressed for success from the waist up, but still like pajama bottoms some days. I feel you there, Robin. We are pretty much the same in our center as well.
I've saved a ton of money on dry cleaning in the last several months.
Yeah, absolutely. Chelsea said, there is a great meme video about dressing from the waist up for a Zoom meeting. The individual forgets he had pajama bottoms on and stands up, suit on top, pajamas on the bottom. I think I've seen that, Chelsea. That's funny. Yeah. But I think we can all relate to those things, right? Okay, well, it is 10:02. I've kept you a little bit after. These presentation slides will be on our website under our DCEO OET training. And you can find that there. You can just search it actually, and it will come up for you. And you can locate any of these resources. These podcasts are really great. Really quickly. The No Sweat public speaking one is one of my favorite ones because they're based out of St. Louis. And so I like that they're a little bit more local to us here in Illinois. And they talk about top sources for developing and hearing a great presentation. And then also the Speaking Club, Mastering the Art of Public Speaking. Sarah Archer, she's actually from the UK, but she uses a lot of humor. So Mark, you might check that out. To increase confidence when public speaking and pitching and being in interviews, she talks about how to use humor and really implement that. So those are really great. So make sure you check those resources out. There will be a feedback survey. I guess today's Friday, so there will be a feedback survey on Monday. Some of you might be off for the holidays, so if you don't get a chance to take it, feel free to take it when you come back from being off for holiday break. But we would love your input. I would love your input on how you like this professional development, how you're liking this series, this LEAD series that we're doing. Any feedback would be great. And with that, Amy, did you have anything? I just want to say happy holidays, everyone. Be safe. I don't know if Amy had anything, but with that, thank you so much, everyone, for attending this morning. And happy holidays, everyone. Have a great rest of your Friday. Have a great weekend. Thank you.